breaking news out of D.C. Let's get back to Megan Casella. Megan?
Hey, Carl, we're just hearing from the president on Truth Social vowing to significantly escalate tariffs against China.
News, another white-knuckle day is already unfolding up on Wall Street.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
After China laid down their reciprocal tariffs and the U.S. tariffs went into effect over the weekend, markets around the world are falling drastically. And overall, I don't think that's a surprise. I feel like we did a pretty good job mapping it out in last week's video on really what to expect from these tariffs. But I think there's about to be some improvements heading our way, and I'll get to that in just a second. For context, I had a great career being an expert negotiator. I had negotiated hundreds of millions worth of deals. But of course, I never worked on the level of billions or trillions, and that level of severity right now, it's kind of scary. When you negotiate, you have to set an initial anchor. It's your starting position so everyone knows where you stand. And typically, it's an unrealistic number that you really never plan to achieve, because in reality, you hope to hit 1/3 to 1/2 of where you start with your anchor. Last week's announcement of tariffs from the US is definitely a lofty anchor. It is way out there. Me personally, I would have never have started a negotiation based on numbers that are that far out.
This is what we understand, what most people understand you did, that essentially you divided the country's trade surplus with the United States by the total exports, and then divided the number by 2 and produced this discounted rate. If you're a trade partner right now, and you've just watched how America has put together that policy, how are you meant to negotiate with that?
As you can tell, I don't believe that we have the intention of making tariffs a long-term plan for the US. My gut is telling me that this is much more geared towards a push for negotiations.
We're going to hold the course. It's not the kind of thing you can negotiate away in days or weeks. That makes it sound like the tariffs are staying in place.
Granted, we have some mixed messages that certainly don't paint that picture. Now, whenever I would negotiate, I would have a very firm stance of a path that I plan to take. And unless the person that I was negotiating with would convince me to move away from that direction and work with them, then they at least knew what was coming. The fact that we're getting a unified message that these tariffs are long-term doesn't really surprise me. To keep leverage in a negotiation, everyone, and I mean everyone, needs to believe that the current path is final, unless there's a compelling reason to change. And right now, I think there's a lot of compelling reasons, and I think there are small tells that are giving away that this is a negotiation.
I've already seen the administration reach out to countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, other nations, and to say, let's open up dialogue to be able to talk.
The White House officials confirmed this morning that more than 50 countries have reached out to the U.S.
The Treasury Secretary here indicating that there is a live negotiation now between the United States and Japan, at least.
Almost, that the U.S. is open to negotiating. And as small as it may sound, I think it is telling of what will happen in the next few weeks. Because on top of having these internal whispers, there's also a lot of screaming and shouting that's happening domestically.
Across the country and around the world today, tens of thousands of people turned out for what organizers say has been the biggest single day of protests against President Trump and his second-term policies and actions.
And all that shouting creates pressure. And when pressure builds up enough, then something definitely needs to give way. But this is not just limited to protesting. It's starting to spill out into business leaders and investors that are making their point of view known.
Bill Ackman, who endorsed Trump and has been a very outspoken supporter of elements of the Trump agenda, he is basically pleading with the president to change course.
Let's go ahead and take a step back, and I realize that's not very hard, to realize there's a lot of pressure being created about this turmoil. And let's assume for a hot moment that tariffs are a long-term play. So with no willingness to negotiate, in 3 months, the markets will bottom out once reciprocal tariffs are announced. Layoffs will be blowing up the news cycle, and inflation is simply going to be way too high. I have to say that I am not a political person. In fact, I see myself as politically agnostic, simply because I don't like any politician. So I'm going to be objective with what I say. Politically, this outcome would be suicide for the Republican Party. It would take a decade for them to recover from a self-inflicted recession. And keep in mind that a lot of Congress and representatives are up for re-election in the next 2 years. And I don't think the Republican Party wants to lose control. Because if they did, I can guarantee you there would probably be another impeachment. And they can't afford to have this go sideways any longer than a few weeks. And as I've stated, moving some of the manufacturing back to the US would easily take an additional 3 to 5 years under the best of conditions.
If you decide you're going to build a factory today, that factory is not going to come online for 3 to 5 years.
In that time frame, the entire political map within the U.S. would be rewritten. And that's why even members within the Republican Party are starting to show their cracks.
Tariffs are a tax on consumers, and I'm not a fan of jacking up taxes on American consumers.
But what's also indisputable is the markets are down about 8% in just 2 days, and I'm getting all kinds of reaction from businesses, farmers.
When McKinley most famously put tariffs on in 1890, they lost 50% of their seats in the next election.
Because when there's pressure, something needs to give. Now, there's another area of pressure that most of you aren't aware of. I happen to be in contact with a lot of large companies. And do you want to know what they're doing? They are pushing so many lobbyists down the throats of politicians that it's almost laughable. It's true that a lot of businesses may not be openly stating their concerns, but I guarantee you that they do have a presence in Washington, and many of them are very big donors that could easily threaten to pull out funding for future elections. Another set of pressure is that other countries are creating trade alliances that have never occurred in the past, and it could easily push the United States to the side if the tariffs go on too long. At this point, we're about to have ourselves a diamond from all this pressure. We have protests happening all around the country. We have financial leaders speaking out against the tariffs. We have political party members breaking from their own party leadership to contest these tariffs. And world stock markets are crumbling. Other countries are reciprocating tariffs with the US. Lobbyists are flooding DC to make sure big companies are voicing their concerns. And there's a reality where future elections are at risk for the controlling party.
When Hot Smoothie put on their tariff in the early 1930s, they lost the House and the Senate for 60 years.
My point in all this is that there have been a lot of small tells that this is a negotiation, and the timeline for a resolution is quite a bit shorter than I originally thought. It's truly just about a 6-week window. If it goes beyond 6 weeks, then the Republican Party is going to be decimated in future elections. That's why I believe that we're going to be hearing a lot more in the next few weeks about how negotiations are starting to bubble up and happen. Because at the end of the day, politicians on both sides are all about self-preservation. However, there is a silver lining in all of this. For the younger investors, this is your golden moment. The past 4 years, the market has been on a tear, and the younger generation has kind of been left out of creating that generational wealth. Well, this is your golden ticket. You should be taking advantage of this drop like it is your once-in-a-lifetime chance. And for most all other investors, if there's a quick turnaround, I hope that you've been dollar cost averaging to make sure that you ride every bit of that wave as it goes back up. And I do believe that this is all about negotiations. And if it wasn't originally planned that way, then I think it will have to shift to becoming a negotiation because there's simply just too much pressure to let it ride long term. Now, I do want to point out that when you look at investing in the short term, it's all red today, and that is extremely uncomfortable. But it's important to zoom out and recognize long term, it only has one direction, up. And that's why we're investors, not gamblers. Because inherently in the short term, the risk of loss exists, but over the long term, it drops down altogether. Whether the market's correct in a few weeks or a few months, you need to be prepared to have your money work for you. That's why I'll continue showcasing top companies that I am counting on rebounding the most when that time hits. In fact, I'll be giving an update on quantum computing stocks where I rank them from best to worst in my next video. And since this is going to be the next big thing, try to get in at a major discount so you can earn the most over the next 10 to 20 years. And as always, thanks again for watching.